Ladies and gentlemen, if you could go ahead and take your seats, please. We got our final speaker for the evening, Ty Simpson. She is with Nimipu, the Nez Perce tribe. She is...
You said both of those things wrong.
But not one,
but both.
He's been here for 2 days, sister. Give him a cut. Cut him a slack.
But she is
I
a
would,
storyteller
but
extraordinaire.
He knows you.
He's heard me say them
I
so
have.
many times.
I have watched her videos. I have watched her TED Talks. I
He
should have my
spoke highly of
pronunciation
you
down
to
by
us on
now.
Thursday.
Well, that's good to know that people say nice things behind my back. Because a lot of people just talk shit to my face, so we'll see how this goes.
So,
Tatskulawat, all of you. Good evening. It's good to be here. I am from the Nimipu Nation, which our colonizers call the Nez Perce tribe of Idaho. In my native language, Nimiputit, Inamunikwas Atit Watit, my name is the storyteller. In the language of our colonizers, I'm called Ty Simpson. I don't know the history of that name. We can only guess. So I am here to just unfuck all of us, ideally. And when I say that,
Oh, my name. I'm unfuckable with.
yes.
Go, come on.
So to give you some background, I work as a community organizer. What else do I do? Do all of the things. Community organizing, anti-racism education is a thing I do. I also work at the Idaho Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence as a social change organizer. So my work on the clock is generally building resource capacity for Native American communities, for our women especially, because of the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the United States. So I do some work on that. I work with the Indigenous Idaho Alliance. It's going to get harder to say that the more often I say it. And we are a loosely organized yet dedicated group of Indigenous folks in the community who focus on a lot of social and political issues, and then will either offer technical assistance, subject matter expertise, presentations of this nature when called upon. So that's primarily who I am in a nutshell. Unfuck yourself. That's I did a similar workshop when I was at the AMP conference, and that AMP stands for Activists Mobilizing for Power. And we did that in a much more informal way. We sat in a circle. I invited everybody to tell me their names. We'll get to that in a second. And then we started talking about we started with what colonization means, and then what colonization is, and how it manifests now in our social and political arenas. And then that's kind of the idea that I'll take in this space as well. And really try to engage you in the conversation as much as possible, because me talking at you is a very colonized thing for me to do. Me even leading with like my job and occupation is also a very colonized thing to do. So I'll do the decolonized version of that very shortly. So if you guys can tell me your names, so I know who's in the room with me, that'd be great.
Dennis George Lambert. Ida Hill.
Dennis
George Lambert.
George Lambert, farmer from Goliath Hill. I like that. Okay.
Fatima Sudanam Namu Christian, or Wasinde Curry, Green Party presidential candidate, the only black woman seeking, 4th generation farmer, and unfuckable witness, my take on social media.
Hey, I love that.
South Central in the house.
Is that really where you're from?
Hell yeah.
Okay.
For real now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
My name's David Gold. David is sort of a joke on his be loved, but I think personally I think you're being despised by everyone.
Be proud of that. There's irony. We like
Yes.
irony in our names, right?
Yes.
I'm Marcine, or Mom, as they've been calling me around here, because I'm Joe's mom.
Oh, lucky you. Good on you for this guy.
Actually, it's lucky him.
Yeah. Okay, Mom.
Hey, snapper, snapper.
I think we've met a couple of times before.
Yes.
Remind me of your name.
We have. I'm Matt Barbie. I actually represent this area of Boise. I'm like a Democrat, but I'm really green. I like. You know, it's just about access and being the person in the room that points out all those things at all the committee meetings
Yeah.
and whatnot, because nobody else will.
And your local claim to fame was the medicinal marijuana?
Yeah, I've been involved as the tech director, multiple, and we're still trying.
So,
We're
woo,
still
woo,
trying.
let's blow for him.
Yep.
Okay, sounds good. Go ahead.
Ashley.
Hi, Ashley. Just here to hang out? I'm for it.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Brendan Phillips. I'm a DJ and political activist from Stansbury Park, Utah.
Okay,
Glad to be here.
all right. Okay. Go ahead.
Name's Abdul Jones, and I flew in from Texas, and I was here to check out the debates.
Oh, okay. Good. Well, welcome to Idaho.
Hi, Trinity. Nice to meet you. Somewhat active in the community, mostly in regards to cannabis. And then we came because we wanted to know a little bit more about what the Green Party is.
I should have come for that too, because I don't know a whole lot about it either. Right? But that's the part of like unfucking ourselves and decolonization. So the real quick, I thank you all for sharing your names with me. I appreciate that. Generally, when I have more time, I ask you to tell me a story because I'm a storyteller and I like to know stuff like that. But I have a very limited amount of time. So I just want to kind of dive right into a couple of things. Before we can understand what decolonization is, we have to understand the history of. Mary, I didn't mean to skip you. I know you.
Oh my God,
Joe.
Joe,
Joe, I know
yeah.
Joe. I'm sorry, I didn't skip people. And then in the back, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name.
I'm Jackie, and I'm a marijuana activist from Idaho City, Idaho.
Okay, Idaho City. Perfect. All right. So decolonization we have to understand what colonization is. As a woman who is Black and Native American, my entire existence is couched in colonization, which kind of lends itself to the work that I do as an anti-racism educator. I take everything, I fight everything, like constantly. I ask all the questions, I challenge everything that people teach me and ask me. College was a miserable experience because of that. I'm constantly challenging all of my professors and teachers about 90% bullshit that they feed us in school. And then at some point we're bought into the fact that at the end of that experience, as tumultuous as it is, that the piece of paper they give us somehow makes us like superior or other to our communities, and that's also very false. Colonization in the United States, we'll start with there, stems and is based entirely on the structures of white supremacy in the United States. To colonize the United States meant to violently displace and dispossess land from the indigenous people of this country, in addition to force displacing slaves, Africans, to this country for labor. So those two things are kind of the pillars of colonization in the United States, entirely to the benefit of white landowning Christian males. That is the cornerstone of colonization in the United States. And then we're going to move forward a little bit into history and what that looks like as far as how they were able to siphon all of that wealth and influence and power in such a way that the systems of the United States support and perpetuate all of that, right? Part of my work in support of the Green Party and part of my work in support of anybody that is an independent in our political system is ideally that we just burn it all to the ground and reestablish or like rebuild something that is meaningful to us as a community, right? Like that's the first step in unfucking ourselves. We have somehow believed in the United States that the choice between two parties is what democracy looks like. That's actually the exact opposite of what a democracy looks like. So we're gonna unfuck ourselves in that way. And then these bullshit things that people tell us about, well, you know, we can't have a third party because it takes away votes from other parties. Like, and then the idea of meritocracy moves itself into, God, all of the other things. God, how much time do I have? Like, we're gonna be here all night. Don't get me started. So now that we have that kind of nutshell version of colonization, how it intersects with oppression, how it intersects with violence, how it intersects with race, and the economy, and then the political system in and of itself, what does unfucking ourselves and decolonization look like? What it looks like is just understanding that everything that we have to focus on comes from a couple of different principles. We can't talk about decolonization if we aren't also having the same conversation about appropriating or repatriating lands back to indigenous people. Like, that's square one. Our land has to come back to us. And it's not saying like once our land comes back to us, we as indigenous people are exacting revenge on every white person. We know that's not at all the case. We are the original stewards of this land on which we have descended for literally tens of thousands of years. It's our land. We are biologically in this land here. So once we get that land back, we go back to the principles, our old ways, right? I talk about this in my TED Talk. Our old ways are a couple of different things. Protect the sacred, give back to community, and keep things in balance. And because we are so colonized, we think that giving land back to indigenous people means that's something less for white people. It is. It's less power. It's less isolation. It's less opportunity to oppress, right? But let's repatriate that land back to indigenous people, then we all have community. We understand that the fish and our elk and our deer and the grass and the plants all have as much value and worth in our circle, in our cycle, in our community as does humanity. I think that colonization has also fucked us in such a way where we somehow believe that we as humanity are separate from nature. Earth doesn't need us. We're this gross, like, incessant cesspool of like mammals that have overgrown ourselves. We are a virus on Earth. We need Earth. Earth doesn't need us, right? The hotter she gets, she's really just trying to purge a virus. And we're okay with that. And did you ask any indigenous people, we're like, well, of course this is happening because we're doing too much. In the beginning, this is an old creation story of ours. I'm going to give you the nutshell version of it. In the beginning, Creator called together all of our large animals on a hillside near Lewiston, Idaho. Mimi people call that area Seminicum. And on that day, Creator told all the large animals that there was going to be a great change and that some of those animals wouldn't survive. But in that process, Creator wanted to make humanity. And he asked each of those large animals to give a part of themselves so that humanity could exist. Salmon, or Natok as we call it, offered himself up first, and he said, I promise to come in the wintertime. Humans can eat my flesh. And then it was the river, and then she offered herself as a life to carry salmon and to carry trout so that humans could exist. And then following that was each of the other animals, from Wolfia, or elk, our deer, moose, ravens, crows, meadowlark, all of the animals as we know them now. The exchange in that when humanity was created was that we keep things in balance, that we never take more than we need, and that we protect the sacred. And we've moved away from that space now with our mineral-based iPhones, the Ford truck that I drive outside, like plastic. We just do too much as humanity. Some of us believe that we are so far gone that we can't come back to this idea of protecting the sacred, but it is entirely possible, right? It is entirely possible if we remember that the priority isn't what I need, but what does our community need? What does the mother need, right? We've legitimately carved presidential faces into what was one of the most sacred sites in indigenous communities, right? To honor presidents. Fuck those presidents. That rock was old, and very sacred. And we defaced it. That is an offense to nature, right? Putting up dams, artificial blocking of rivers, because somehow we think that's better for us as humanity, is an offense to nature. And we bought into it, right? At some point we voted for those politicians. At some point we said it was okay that those things took place with our tax dollars. That's where we have to unfuck ourselves and decolonize. The freer our rivers run, the healthier our planet becomes. It's just restorative, it's regenerative. And then another piece to that is the politics of it, right? Generally, and this is my nutshell, like what I hear from like the Farm Bureau. I worked for the Farm Bureau for a couple of years, probably 2 of the most horrible years of my life, honestly. And in those 2 years, you learn about how they feel and what they believe about why we have these dams. And it's always this argument of, well, electricity, good thing there's not a giant nuclear ball of fire in the sky, right? And in relying on that, and in relying on science, like, and this is old knowledge that indigenous people have had for thousands and thousands of years. We have to unfuck ourselves and saying, What do indigenous people know that we don't know, right? What kind of knowledge that comes from the land that we've been carrying for thousands of generations do we know that science is just now catching up with, right? I always find it entertaining. And Facebook is a narcissist cesspool, right? So every once in a while you get on there and you see all of these arguments from folks and they're like, well, Native Americans were savages and we're killing each other and this, that, and the other. But really, what we know of ourselves and our communities, that we would move from place to place following the seasons. And the reason why we did that, the reason why permanent structures weren't erected all the time, was entirely because we were keeping things in balance. To erect permanent structures in nature is almost an offense against nature. That's not the way it's supposed to work. Things are supposed to come and go. Things are supposed to change. Things are supposed to end. But when humanity decided colonization was the way of the world, we started doing the most damage, digging into our mother, cutting into our mother, tearing down all of the trees. The Amazon is on fire. Like that's the strongest, oldest forest on the planet. And we're losing it because we want quinoa, you know. There are so many things, and I'm trying to illustrate a lot of different pieces of what colonization looks like now and what decolonization should be. And really, the end piece of this is, if colonization was to completely and violently destroy a culture and people in order for the systems as we know it to exist, then decolonization then is to completely deconstruct that system, burn it all the way to the ground, and build it again anew. A while ago, a friend of mine likened me to a Pop-Tart, soft on the inside, but hard on the outside, or an egg, hard on the outside, soft on the inside. And I decided that I'm more like a volcano, right? Like soft on the inside, but I totally kill you. You know, like you just don't go traipsing around inside of a volcano. I'm not really that violent, I promise. Sometimes, kind of. But the idea of that, and I really like the idea of that, because volcanoes destroy. Nature is merciless as fuck, right? We understand that she will take a life without question. But in that destruction is regrowth and rebirth. Those are the principles of decolonization that we really have to rely on and that we have to lean on again in order to have better and stronger communities. We keep just putting Band-Aids on things, right? I appreciate removing plastic from our everyday use as I'm holding this plastic bottle, right? But why is it that we are so focused on plastic straws rather than entirely dismantling our reliance on fossil fuel worldwide, right? We're super focused on like the small individual things because that's the colonization piece, like meritocracy and American dreams and shit. What we do on an individual basis somehow makes the collective good better. No, what we do collectively makes the collective good better. That's the way nature works. Nothing exists singularly in nature, right? There are herds of elk, there are schools of fish, there are groups and clearings of trees. Everything exists in community in nature, and we stopped doing that. When we come to this point now, like with being so fucked that everybody's got boots and we've got bootstraps and we're supposed to take care of our own and take care of our family without realizing that we are all part of the same circle. And if one cell is sick in our bodies, the rest of the body takes care of you, right? And now we've just got all of these individual cells, individual people, and each individual person is sick. So of course the community's sick. Of course our institutions are damaged and dysfunctional. Of course, and as a result, we're continuing to poison and do damage to nature. Like I really could go on, like I'm preaching to the choir in this case. And
not really. There's a lot of folks who are colonizers believing that they're liberals. Had you been here earlier, you would have experienced some racist folks and some sexist folks, but because they use the label green, they don't realize their behavior is not anti-racist, it's racist and it's sexist. So I was really, the whole fuckable is call it out. I'm with you.
Oh, absolutely. I do that.
The choir ain't all here. It ain't here.
You bring to mind something else that actually really entertains me about living in Boise. Just because somebody proclaims to be green or liberal or progressive doesn't mean that they're not racist, right? We are all, well, that's going to be tricky. How can I position this? I was going to say we're all racist, but people of color can't be racist. So that's step number one.
No.
People of color cannot be racist.
Well,
About that.
there's internalized racism too.
Absolutely internalized racism, absolutely internalized oppression, but people of color, as a body politic, since that's what we're talking about, cannot be racist. All caps, full stop. I love that book, and I love Dr. Kendi. I don't get on board with what he's talking about, and here's why. I follow more of the Ta-Nehisi Coates model of the way we understand race,
Okay.
right?
All right.
So people of color can absolutely be prejudiced, and I think that's what all of, like, when white people get uncomfortable with me saying that out loud, that's what they want to say, like, reverse racism. That doesn't exist. Reverse racism doesn't exist. But what we conflate is that racism and prejudice are not the same thing. When white people have hurt feelings that are based on race, that's not the same thing as oppression. So racism and prejudice are not the same thing. Do we all understand that, or do you guys need 101 on that also? Right? So when I say people of color cannot be racist in the United States because colonization has been built and so deeply embedded in such a way in this country that people of color have never had power. Racism is about power. So until that pendulum shifts or situates itself in such a way where everybody is equal and equitable and has equitable access, people of color cannot be racist because they have never had power. Y'all follow me?
Can I ask something?
Yes, ma'am.
This degree black woman lived in Africa with a school on Naval Medical Scholarship. Got one big thing from this 6 weeks ago. Because I'm at an ANC, that's our annual meeting. I'm sitting on stage thinking, okay, these people, in my mindset, ignorant, hateful. But I had a aha. I'm looking at it all, these people not stupid. They're not ignorant. Why are they buying into this racist stuff? So I came home with that question in my heart. I found this, I read it, and I said that, oh yeah, I've been racist because I've lived in Ghana, West Africa for 31 years, and I refer to Ghana as a developing nation. So I had to deconstruct my language about mainly Africa, not about being black, because that's so real and red in my life, but my look of the world, though I fight for the freedom, total liberation of black people, all of that. My words ran into the concepts of racist, so I've been bold enough to say, I was a racist 6 weeks ago, until I deconstructed my language. And so that's why I don't even like the word racist. So it took me a move to but just for now, this year I'm using it. Next year I might come up with something on my own, but I understand and accept where you are. But
that's interesting. So now my sociological brain is looking at that. Like, I don't
You
necessarily
see?
think that that's racism, but that is a symptom of colonization. Like, we're fucked in this country because somehow we've centralized like the entire worldview on being American, right?
Oh, wow.
American is 2 fucking continents. That's a whole damn hemisphere.
Thank you.
Like, so that's one thing we also have to unfuck ourselves with.
Yes.
But what, like, the position that you took in relation to being American versus Ghanaian is that they were developing in relation to the United States, right?
Yes.
Like, that's I don't think that's a race thing. That's a colonization
Thank you.
thing, right? Like, I'm not trying to validate you. Like,
I'm trying to move past it my damn self.
I'm hella
It's my own
prejudiced.
issue.
I will own all of that. Like, I think on a daily basis to myself, I'm like, God, fucking white people are exhausting. Like, at least 6 times a day. Like, constantly. At least 6 times a day. And the people who are close enough to me, white people who are close enough to me, hear me say it in meetings, right? Like, hear me say it at a lot of my speeches and gatherings. And the reason why that is, like, that's a prejudicial thing that I'm constantly having to answer the same series of questions or overcome the same bullshit every time I stand up to speak. But I'm gonna keep doing it. 1, because sometimes they pay well. And your girl's got student loan debt.
Okay.
But in other times, like, I don't do this work as an activist because, like, I'm not trying to be a martyr in any of this. I don't have any idyllic version of my future planned out. I do this work because I don't want my nieces, who are now 7 and 12, to have to stand up here and do this in 30 years. Fuck that. Like, if I can stop it now, we're stopping it now. If I can help them to, like, grow up in such a way where they don't need to ever be unfucked, where they're just pro-humanity, pro-love, pro-truth, pro-justice. That's what I'm trying to put into the world. This comes from a place of truth and justice and love. And that comes from Dr. Cornel West, another hero of mine, right? Like, he's truth, justice, and love. That's where we're at. So let me circle this back.
Thank you, though. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's good. Like, really, when we talk about, there's so many pieces and so many intersections of colonization, like deconstructing them can't be delineated, right? And a lot of us come into this work, when a lot of us move into politics, we try to address singular issues, even when we're liberal and even when we're progressive, and we ask when it's singularly cannabis or singularly single-payer healthcare, any of those things, all of those things intersect, right? Because if we start talking about legalizing marijuana, we need to really start talking about letting a whole lot of black and brown people free from prison, right? But we don't want to have that conversation. We want to start talking about, like, let's start talking about what law enforcement is like. Why do they are above the law in their moments interacting with civilization and civil society, but they've had 6 weeks of training? Fuck all that. Like, I don't trust cops for shit, right? Like, 6 weeks of training and you want me to trust this guy? Absolutely not. We need to start having those conversations. That's all part of these conversations of unfucking ourselves. They are all intersected, and they are all deeply embedded in the foundation of our country. Thank you for asking questions. I was about to invite you to do that.
It's not just 6 weeks of training that's the problem. It's the type of training they're given. They're not trained to de-escalate.
Yeah.
They're trained to basically enforce law that they don't have enough time to understand.
Mm-hmm. And this is after an upbringing of being indulged and entitled most of their lives, right? I aspire in my life to have the confidence of mediocre white men. Like, I want that level of confidence. Because really, like, their existence in the world is entirely just like, I get this thing solely because I'm a white dude, right? I recently attended a conference or a training in Minneapolis, Minnesota, at this nice hotel attached to the Mall of America. And in it was, I'm going to call them out, Stryker Medical Group, or the medical sales Stryker, had their own sales conference in that same hotel. I always try to make friends with the housekeeping staff because you get some fun perks. They're really nice. They tell funny stories. You get a free newspaper. Great. I was talking to the young woman who was cleaning my room, and she said earlier that morning, one of the other rooms had a white male guest who had propositioned her for sex. She turned him down, and he threatened her job. So I work in sexual, like, domestic violence and the movement to end that shit. So I'm immediately fired up. Like, so what happened? Can you tell me more? And this is me with my, like, mediocre Spanish at best, and her trying to slow down her Spanish so I can understand. She was explaining to me that their manager is very competent and very strong, and in no way allows for those complaints to affect this young woman or anybody on her staff, and that gentleman was dealt with appropriately. But of course, I want to go knock on his fucking door, like, can I have a conversation with you, please, right? But the fact that they have that so normalized that there are policies in place to protect young women rather than policies in place to kick assholes like that out of the hotel is why we have so many problems that we have in the first place, right? So that is a microcosm and an illustration of why we are so fucked in this country if we don't start to dismantle these systems, right? Dismantle these daycares that let boys be boys and punish girls for fighting, right? Or even into adulthood, where, and this is my opportunity in this work too, understanding and including gender fluidity and nonconformity in my language, so I actually should have apologized for that first. I generally speak very dichotomously about that, when that doesn't exist in nature either. It is very fluid, it is, and just the way that we are fucked and colonized is it's always A or B, male, female, red or blue, black or white, you know, those are the things that I'm trying to unfucking myself. And that's the other thing too, that we don't ever find ourselves in a position or allow ourselves to be in a position where we're vulnerable in that way, right? I don't know everything in this work. Everything is a constant learning process. And understanding that that's what's supposed to happen in nature, right? Things are always a process. It's always a cycle, and we have to give ourselves grace to learn through those things. You know, we're never going to be able to deconstruct and rebuild if we're so stuck and attached to these, like, well, I made a mistake, so now I'm gonna fight everybody who tries to call that mistake out. That's not how this goes, right? We don't live in a place that's life or death necessarily. If I use the wrong pronouns, I will always try to call myself out in that moment, or identify that I'm still learning in that process and it's never done from a malicious place. But damn my intent, right? That's the other thing too. My intent can go fuck itself. Really, it's the impact of what our language and our words have on the world, and none of us ever really want to own that. That is another piece of unfucking ourselves for decolonization. So we've kind of piled on a lot, and I kind of run through this very quickly because I could do this for hours. And we got to do this. We got to do this. If there's anything that you should really take away from today, is one that decolonization is about repatriating land to indigenous people, centering and amplifying indigenous voices, right? Our science is old and we know better. Our knowledge and our creation stories are old and we know better. And the fact that we've been silenced as these savages or uneducated beings in this big picture of the United States is wrong, because it's us that are stewards of the land. It's us that knows better, because that's been passed generation to generation to generation, whether our language was stolen from us or not, whether we were forced displaced, whether we were forced sterilized. That knowledge is so strong and so deeply embedded in this earth that we're standing on. And because we have such strong tactile relationships to nature, that's where the knowledge is. Those are the voices that we should be hearing from. And a lot of that too, if you are on a PTO or a PTA, anytime you vote, anytime you're sitting on a commission, anytime you have an opportunity and somebody passes you the mic, are you thinking to yourself, am I the best person to be speaking on this, or is there an indigenous person that we should be centering? And we don't ever use that lens, right? And I'm not saying every single indigenous person. We have plenty of charlatans. We have plenty of problematic people like any society would. But there are still culture keepers in a lot of our nations. There are people who speak their language fluidly and would offer, insight in situations such as these. But I got really tired of being invited to offer only in land acknowledgements. Are you guys familiar with land acknowledgements? So to give you a nutshell, so they started in California, where the beginning of every gathering of mixed race people, an indigenous person would stand up, or even a white person who was well informed would stand up and offer a recognition of the indigenous people on whose ancestral territory we're standing on. I could do that right now. I could do that at any point in this conversation. But they were doing it as something very performative, right? Now that we've acknowledged where we're standing, let's keep it moving. We've checked a box, we're moving on. That's not doing shit but making people feel warm and fuzzy inside. We really have to stop doing political change work and social change work from a place that's codifying to white people, right? That's something that really needs to change. Yes, sister? Yeah.
So now that you let it out the bag, how can 7 men represent women in a presidential candidate? How come this is white privilege? And I don't think people understand that talk is nice, but it ain't shit if you're not educating, empowering, training, and leading. So you nice white folk, stop that shit.
Take a seat, yeah.
It's just pissing me off.
Here's a perfect example of that. So the NDN Collective and the National Congress of American Indians hosted the Native American Presidential Forum a month and a half ago. Everybody who went down there to speak offered land acknowledgement, recognized XYZ Nation. And then the next week, and then the following weeks, anytime any of them stood up to speak somewhere, they didn't do the land acknowledgement, right? That's that bullshit, and we need to unfuck ourselves from that, right? And that's the other piece too. I got to stand up and do the land acknowledgement in front of the Ada County Democrats Gala a few weeks ago. It was lovely. And that's what, and at that same place was the president of the Young Democrats of America. His first question to me was, how can I get you recruited? Because I don't ascribe to any of this shit, right? I am indigenous first. This whole fucking system could come crumbling down and I'm gonna be fine. I know how to hunt, fish, gather, and take care of my community while keeping nature in balance. I'm confident in that. There are plenty of us in our nation who could do that. So, to answer his question, I said, well, you can start by giving me more than 5 minutes with the mic at the beginning of a gala. 5 minutes. That's what they offered me, right? Joe offered me an hour, probably 2, I think 2 hours was the initial offer, but I was offered time. You have a story, you have a voice that needs to be centered and amplified in this work, and that's what came of it. And so I always look at things like that when people invite me to participate in their events, and when any indigenous person is invited to present. The Boise Public Library, I'm calling every fucking buddy out right now. Boise Public Library is hey, can we get dancers and singers? That's performative as fuck. I am a professional woman who does anti-race and anti-violence education in the community and in the region, but they want me to dress up and dance. If that's not a fucking minstrel show, I don't know what is, right? But they won't own that because they think they're progressive and liberal and trying to provide this to the young people in the community. Absolutely not. Let me stand up and talk to these children about what decolonization is. Hey, cute white kids, you're on indigenous land, and as you grow up, give it back. Right? That's that shit. Like, just give it back. And every time Boise City, there's a couple of city council members that are great. They're well-intentioned white people, very progressive, very liberal, so they think, that always ask, well, what can we do to support and show up for indigenous communities in Boise? Give the land back. And they all just laugh, right? They laugh and they chuckle. And I'm like, deadpan, not fucking laughing.
Yeah, real.
Give our land back.
Real.
And then there was somebody recently who responded to that thread that was like, well, they don't have the authority. And so, okay, let's take that back. Where was the fucking authority when they took the land in the first place, right? That's the lens that we have to start adopting when we look at things politically, when we make social change movements, when we drive this work. We have to push past these boundaries that we know to be comfortable. Well, what about authority? And what about votes? And what about democracy? We don't have a democracy in this country. If there's anything that this president is telling us, we don't have a democracy here. It's a shit show. Fix it, right? Give the land back. Rebalance nature. Give back to our communities. Let's see what happens. Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Do you share about the doctrine and discovery? Because with the Naka Party, because I am of red blood, I know about the doctrine of discovery, the Berlin Conference. Are you the only one in the room talking about that? Or how do you get folks to realize this is based on the Catholic Pope, this and that, and changing the whole conversation about this is historic wrong?
That's a good question. How much time do we have? That's a heavy question. Mark Charles, who is the independent running for presidential, he's great. Like, he's really, really smart man, and I really appreciate hearing everything he has to say. His TED Talk was specifically on what that conversation should look like. I haven't ever adopted it into my conversations or my teaching, only because the rooms generally don't have the intellectual capacity to handle it, honestly, right? We're so, we're used to self-checkout and swiping right and swiping left and Uber Eats and all of these like very instant gratifying sorts of processes and systems that we have now, right? Which means that it's too much to really understand the nuances and depth of the doctrine of discovery, of manifest destiny, of palpable, like all of those things that have taken place to oppress entire groups of people worldwide. Not past tense, like this is still taking place. It's absolutely still taking place. The indigenous communities in the United States celebrated Orange Shirt Day earlier this month. And Orange Shirt Day represents an honoring and awareness around the Indian boarding schools. And that generation is still alive, right? Those are my grandpas and grandmas and my aunties and my uncles that were forced displaced into boarding schools, disconnected entirely from their land, their language, and their people, and then were put back into their communities to force and essentially inspire assimilation to the rest of the community and to their children thereafter. That shit didn't work. That's how you know our blood runs so strong, because it's in the earth, it's in the river, it's in the fire here. Like, we belong here, and we have a strong knowledge, and it will survive. Our resilience is out of control, and that's okay, because nature needs that. The planet needs that. So to more succinctly answer your question, I don't often bring it into the conversation unless I know the audience can handle it, right? Unless I know that that's something that they can, because it's not just emotion or intellectual intelligence, it's emotional intelligence also. To stand in front of my most recent anti-racism education was a workshop, and it was predominantly a room full of white police officers in eastern Idaho, or eastern Washington and northern Idaho area. That was the heaviest hour and 15 minutes of my life. It was just because I had to stay calm and breathe through the animosity and their bullshit. Again, white people exhaust me. So I was standing in that room trying to explain how deeply embedded this racism is and how it's always relegated to this historical, individualized issue, not something that takes place in real time, right? Indigenous people are a historical monolith. All we know is Pocahontas and Geronimo, and it stops. When in fact that there are hundreds of thousands more languages and people and stories that we really need to amplify and center. Like, let's start with that piece. I don't know. Like, I could really, I take a good gauge of my audience, generally speaking, before I stand up and speak. I generally try to know who's going to be there, who's in the room. But I also don't want to do that in such a way where people feel alienated from the knowledge that I'm trying to offer, or that people feel as if I'm belittling people's existence. That's not at all the case. I challenge white people in a very heavy way every time I stand up and speak, but it does come from a place of love. One of my other favorite Coyote stories talks about how Coyote created the different races. It's a very contemporary story, just because we didn't necessarily have the need for this story in our old ways. So in the new way, Coyote makes a mold, he builds a fire, he mixes clay, and he puts his first mold into his fire. He was really excited, so he pulled that mold out very quickly, too quickly. It was undercooked, almost white. It's like Coyote said, "Watu yokta'a," or no, this isn't quite right. And so he threw that mold across the ocean, just chucked it, right? And indigenous people, native Nimipu people, that's what we came to call Soyapa, or white people. He made another mold, and he mixed his clay, and he put that in the fire, and this time he got distracted. He ran off to the prairie, he ran back down to the river, he was messing around with otter and salmon, and then he comes back to his fire, and then he pulls that mold out, and it's dark, overcooked, it's black. Watu yokta'a, that's not quite right. And so he threw that mold to the south. And then in his third mold, he waited by his fire, and so he danced and he prayed, and then when he pulled that mold out, it was perfect. Yokta'a, yes, this is right. We're called to token. And that's an illustration of how Nimipu people understand different races. But I always circle back to the beginning of that story, especially with this new lens and this new work that I'm doing. Y'all are undercooked, but Coyote created you, which makes you part of my community. Exactly, right? We're created from the water, we're created from the earth, and we're connected in that way. Indigenous people often find themselves walking in two worlds. Black people, we do it as code switching, but indigenous people legitimately have to hold tightly to our languages and our culture and our families and our ways of knowing, while at the same time navigating college and banks and 9-to-5s, and then still trying to remember who we are in all of that. And in walking in two worlds, right, we are just so colonized and bought into the fact that we have to exist in a healthy way within a colonized society. We forget that maybe our old ways of knowing are the only ways, are the best ways, are the ways that we take care of ourselves and each other in community. Part of my TED Talk was exactly that point. Like, maybe it's time for white people to join in our world, right? Come in, take a seat, but don't, let us lead. And that is very, very difficult for non-Native people to wrap their heads around. What does it look like when there is more than 2 Native American women in our House of Representatives? What happens when we have more than 1 Native American federal judge in the United States? What happens when we have prosecutors and sheriff's departments that are led by Black, brown, and indigenous women particularly? And I'm not saying you're excluding men from this process, but women are also severely underrepresented in these institutions. That is the problem with colonization. We have been bought into the idea that white men, white Christian men, are the experts, and somehow that's what allows us to exist in a healthy way. Not at all. Burn that system to the ground. Women have been running the world in indigenous communities worldwide for millennia. It's just white men that wrote the history books, right? It's white men that tell the history. I'm a descendant of Chief Red Heart of the Nez Perce Nation. And the story of Chief Red Heart, he was very defiant. He was a non-treaty chief. And from what I know of my descendants and my grandmothers, we're matrilineal. While Chief Red Heart got all of this recognition after being arrested by General Howard, being imprisoned at Fort Vancouver, and then having some of our people die while they were imprisoned, I also know, because I am a Red Heart, that there was a whole strong-ass line of indigenous women in there, of Nimipu women making decisions, influencing, keeping the family strong, learning how to harvest and gather, and keeping us moving through history. And the same goes for all of the BIA agents that were assigned to the Nez Perce Reservation and the Chauvin Indian Reservation. Those BIA agents only wrote the history of the men they were interacting with. when we know from even now, because we still have this cultural practice, that when we sit at sweat, or we sit at family ceremony, or we sit in longhouse, women are the ones who are making strategic and tactical decisions for our families and our communities. What does that look like if we decolonize ourselves to such a degree where that's the norm? We don't think twice about it when there are 9 Supreme Court women as justices, predominantly black and brown women, right? What does that look like? We just don't know. And instead of looking at it from a place of fear or being aghast, we look at it as the ideal, right? Maybe we should, let men hang out and take a seat. Joe Biden needs to take a seat. Bernie Sanders needs to take a seat. Like, bless him, but he needs to take a damn seat. Beto O'Rourke needs to take a seat. Beetlejuice needs to take a seat. Whatever that is. Yeah. Yes.
I got a question. How do you feel about identity politics, then?
Identity politics doesn't exist right alongside reverse racism.
Right.
Yeah. Everything about the body politic is personal. Politics is personal, right?
Yeah.
But not individual. Personal, but not individual. What affects us individually, it's really hard to articulate this point. And I tried it once and I failed miserably, so I'm going to try to rethink it right now. The unfucking ourselves part of decolonization is understanding that nothing that happens to me individually is only mine.
Intersectionality.
And intergenerational. The stories that I carry, Titwata Inanitsa, that translates to the stories that I carry aren't mine. The stories that I carry are hundreds of years of ancestral wisdom. And what happens to me in my lifetime belongs to my descendants. Nothing is mine, right? And if we can think about our own existence in that way, how powerful would we be, and not power in an oppressive way, but powerful in a community and a collective building way, that we understand that what happens to me happens to Joe, happens to Mary, happens to David. Like, those are all the things that if that's the lens that we use, that's truly unfucking ourselves. Identity politics is just another, semantics that one party likes to use over another to belittle or even...
it's another form of colonization.
Yeah, exactly it. Inflammatory language too, like playing on emotions versus encouraging knowledge and storytelling, right? 90% of the time, because I live in Boise, I have to walk into a room and prove my credibility first. Rattle off all my degrees, rattle off where I went to school, rattle off all my experience. I am a storyteller first. I am indigenous first. That in and of itself is my credibility. And then we build and work from there. But we're just not in that place yet, I've prattled on for like 45 minutes. Who's got questions? Like, what other questions do we have? Go ahead. Yeah.
I kind of get your vibe on decolonization, but the action Brian I hear, I've been getting off for about years, is that people not seeking equality, but it's just a way to justify their own jerk behavior. It's kind of a race, instead of seeking equality, they're trying to race to the bottom. You see Mr. and Mrs. White folk, being jerks, therefore I need to be a jerk too. It's like, well, we're equal now. It's like that's not the way.
A race to the bottom. I really like that you just said that. Absolutely. My goal in all of this is not, in all of my work, it's not survival or resilience anymore. Like, we used to throw those words around a lot in Native American communities, like the resilience of enduring displacement, dehumanization, colonization, all of those things, right? The goal is to thrive. The goal is to collectively thrive. And thrive in such a way where the diversity between all of us is seen as a strength and not a checkbox, not, something that we have departments for. It's just the standard. It's normalized. And racing to the bottom is exactly right. The fact that, colonization has us arguing over what crumbs are left after billions of dollars are siphoned into 1% of the population. Like, my poor people's problems are not the problems, it's not the fault of other poor people, right? Like, me being sick and my lack of access to healthcare isn't somebody else who's also sick. It's not their fault either. Like, we are fucked in such a way where we're thought that our problems are some other individual's problem. It's the system's problem. Like, that's the shit that needs to be burned to the ground.
System change, no deals, system change.
System change. No more Band-Aids, no more forums, no more commissions, no more appropriation from Congress. All of it is just an entire system change.
Yeah.
Yes?
So, perhaps beginnings, I don't know. Who has like a value system that breaks down like Otto and then ways. Is there that? Honesty, wisdom, generosity.
Oh, that's a good question. We can't hear you.
Her question was essentially, does the Ninipu, my nation, have a value system that can be broken down in a way like the Lakota people have broken down their value? They actually have an ethics code that's amazing. Google it and read it. The Standing Rock Indian Reservation or the Standing Rock Tribe has an incredible ethics code. I encourage anybody to read it if you have the capacity or access. Just give it a Google. My nation doesn't have it because we still rely so heavily on oral storytelling. A lot of those things are not recorded. The Lakota people relied on, okay, they have this like white man's knowledge and are now trying to like out-white man the white man with all of these tools, right? And they're doing a damn good job of it because if that ethics code is any indication. I still rely on learning from my aunties that I just go in, I start laundry, I make a pot of coffee, and then I sit down and listen. Oh, I read this thing. And they tell, my favorite thing about storytelling in my community, that is the value system because it's just so obscure. Like we could be talking about, you know, some sale at the mall and like what Auntie's interaction was with people while she was there, you know, what happened at the end. But in there were like 5 stories about values, right? Patience, humility, you know, dignity, recognizing humanity, doing things from a place of love, taking your time, following through. And that's the thing. So it teaches like critical listening because we've been doing this since I've been doing this since I was a baby. And a lot of the time, if you grow up in the reservation community, this is also something you have exposure to. So no, short answer, no, we don't have a written value system that way. But all of the values are in every single story that I've told tonight. If I told them in extended form, you would hear it. But I mean, I gave you the abridged version. The value system is couched in storytelling. And we need to circle back to that, right? What other questions do we have? The last time I did this workshop, there was one of the pieces of feedback that I received was that somebody came in and wanted like a checklist of how to do the unbucking, right? The checklist of decolonization. And I don't have one, right? There isn't a list, post-it note that I can give you. You do all of these things, then you're decolonized. No, I still drive a truck. I'm still drinking out of a plastic bottle. You know, I probably still waste more food than I care to admit. You know, and it's all in those small changes. And then when it comes to participating in politics, I try not to. But in the big picture, the political system as it stands right now is about allocating resources. I may not necessarily need those resources, but there are poor people in my community who do. So I will continue to vote. I will continue to have input. But every single time anybody asks for that input, I will also say, burn the system to the ground and build it up in such a way where we don't have inequitable access to resources. Because that's not how we existed in nature prior to now. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. How am I for time? Did I hit that timing right?
You did good.
Okay.
Yeah, about 55 minutes. Thereabout.
God, that is a whole lot of information to cover in a very small amount of time.
It is.
Yeah. How do we feel? Does anybody feel down? No? Okay. I always worry about that. I'm the Debbie Downer. Sorry if your name is Debbie. Nobody said your name was Debbie in here, though. Okay. Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, I hope your run, your candidacy is fruitful.
It's been fruitful because we're starting the Shirley Chisholm People of Color Leadership Institute. So despite what happens, we're set to train folks of color to eventually rule and lead.
Yeah.
Because there's no system in place to stop male chauvinism, stop white privilege. But I can help and show people how to run. And get other folks who have run to show us how to do that.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm called like, I've been a nice girl. But now I'm slapping and hitting and dropping. I've had enough of being a good girl.
I've been doing that. And it comes at a cost though. Like I've had dead cats left at my house.
Oh, I ain't worried about
The
that.
threat- the
I
threats
live in
of
the
rape
project.
and
I got
that.
12 brothers all in the jail.
Uh-huh.
Fuck with me and see. They are willing to die for me. I'm not non-violent. I think it's lovely, but fuck with me and see. 12 brothers all been